Hey everyone! If you're new here, thanks for checking me out. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for coming back. Today I want to show you 5 of the best tips for sewing a straight line. This is perfect if you're a beginner, you haven't gotten much practice with sewing yet, and your lines are a little bit wonky. These are going to be some great tips for you to try to get that perfect straight line. So let's just jump right into it. The first tip is to use some type of seam guide. There are a lot of types out there. One of the really common ones looks like this. This is a magnetic one. So basically, you would place it on your machine wherever you need your seam allowance to be. And then when you're sewing, you would have your fabric butted right up against that. And basically, as you go through, your fabric is just going to glide along that edge so that you're sewing an evenly spaced seam allowance as well as a straight line all the way through. Now, you do have to be careful with magnetic ones because they do say that it can sort of harm the electronics if you're using a computerized machine like I am. But that is one option. This is another option. This is a sticky one. It has a sticky back, so you can move it to wherever you'd like. You can position it. This one is by Clover. I will link this below in the description, as well as a magnetic one. But it's the same concept. Again, you place it wherever you need to at whichever seam allowance. And then when you're sewing your fabric, it will just glide through, butt up against that edge, and you'll have an even seam allowance as well as a straight line. There are also markings right here on your needle plate. So let me see if I could zoom in here. And you can see that there are measurements here. If you are unsure what these measurements are, definitely check your manual. My manual tells me right here that the distance between the markings in the upper scale is 1/8 of an inch, and the distance between the markings in the grid is 5 millimeters, and it shows here. So that way you know these are 1/8 of an inch apart at the top here, and you can gauge your seam allowance that way. Again, you would just line up the edge of the fabric with whichever guideline you need according to the seam allowance that you're using. And just make sure that your fabric stays even with that marking the entire time. There are also special presser feet and things like that. Unfortunately, I don't have any of those, so I can't demonstrate those, but that might be another thing to look into if you're really interested in using a different presser foot. Tip number 2 is going to be similar, but basically it's going to be using some other type of marking, so not necessarily like an item like this, but just another type of marking right on your needle plate to mark your seam allowance and use that as a guide, especially if you're doing quilting or something like that where you use the same seam allowance a lot. This tip is helpful. So you can use washi tape or masking tape or painter's tape, some type of tape that is easily removable. What you can do is bring it over. You can mark wherever your seam allowance is and keep that on your needle plate. Again, you would, as you're sewing, just make sure that the edge of your fabric stays right along the edge of that washi tape, and that will ensure you have an even seam allowance as well as a straight line. Tip number 3 is to actually mark your seam allowance and your seam line right on your fabric. So you can use something like this. This is a water erasable pen by Cricut. This is my favorite one. I will link it below. There are also air erasable pens as well, so you can choose your favorite non-permanent marking tool. Take a ruler, measure the seam allowance on your fabric, and then just mark that straight line. And you can see that even though this is quite a dark fabric, you can still see that marking line really well. So that's why I love this pen. Once again, you're going to put your fabric under your presser foot, put your needle down, and then just sew right along that line that you made. Makes it very quick and easy to have a straight seam. Tip number 4 is don't watch the needle. Now this might be sort of contrary to what you believe, but they say if you watch the needle too closely that basically you're kind of hyper focused on that and you can move your fabric all around and things like that. If you've ever heard someone say, like when you're carrying a bowl or a cup that's really full of liquid, sometimes people will say, don't look at the bowl or don't look at the cup. It's sort of the same type of thing. So once again, you're going to put your fabric under, and as you're sewing, you're going to pay attention to whatever guide you're using. So whether that's the edge of the presser foot, whether that's your washi tape, whether that's your seam guide, whatever you're using to eyeball your seam allowance, that's what you want to pay attention to and not the needle. This will just help you focus on keeping the edge of the fabric exactly where you want it to be. That's what you want to pay attention to. Not where the needle is sewing, but where the edge of the fabric is, and make sure that the edge of the fabric stays exactly where it needs to be. And my last tip is just practice. Take scraps of fabric, practice, practice, practice. You can get some very cheap fabric at Walmart on clearance, at Joann Fabrics. They have a remnant bin. You can also go to a thrift store and buy like a bed sheet, cut that up and use that for practice for, you know, a couple dollars. You can probably get that or something like that. So you don't have to invest a lot of money, but just practice, practice, practice. And practice definitely makes perfect. So those are my 5 best tips for sewing a straight line. Thank you so much for watching. Please like the video, consider subscribing, leave a comment below on what else you'd like to learn about sewing. And until next time, bye.